Hello everybody and welcome to JTV. Over the last day or so, I'm sure you've all seen the horrendous scenes taking place in Afghanistan as the Taliban has taken hold of the country. Now obviously JTV is a Jewish channel, a global Jewish channel, but I feel very strongly that we can't ignore what's going on in the wider world, and also what's happened here is going to have ripple effects across the Middle East and across the wider world. And it's very important that we get to grips with and understand what's going on around the world, and in this instance, what's happening in Afghanistan. And I thought who better to talk about what's happening than geopolitical expert Dr. Alan Mendoza, who is the Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society, and of course, a very good friend of JTV as a former presenter on our channel. And in fact, Alan, the last time that I was in contact with you, I saw you walking out of a room with former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. So if anyone has anything to say about the current situation, it's Alan Mendoza, who deals every day in the world of geopolitics and current affairs and foreign affairs. So Alan, thank you so much for taking the time out to join us here on JTV.
A pleasure, Ollie. As always, nice to be back.
Yeah, so it's great to have you, and we look forward to delving into some of these issues and to have you shed some light on some of these issues, because this situation is not simple. It's not straightforward. So why don't we just start off by just you explaining to us briefly what's happened, what's taken place, and how did America and the UK not see this coming? And I know that a lot of people are sort of saying this was down to a swift withdrawal from Afghanistan, but I think it's also important to recognize that this was also a policy of the Trump administration to withdraw, I believe, although people are debating yes, but it shouldn't have been done so speedily. So can you just take us through what's happened and how was this able to happen?
Well, thank you, Ollie. It's a really complicated situation, but I actually want to take you back, all of you back to 2001, because I think in order to understand what's happened now, you have to remember what happened back in 2001 and why we were in Afghanistan in the first place. So 2001, 9/11, Twin Towers brought down by Al-Qaeda terrorists based in Afghanistan. As a result of that, the US and allied coalition invaded Afghanistan once its rulers, the Taliban, refused to basically give al-Qaeda up to them. And essentially, we've spent the last 20 years, kind of fighting the Taliban, trying to clear out the terrorists, and of course, at the same time, restoring democratic governance to Afghanistan and attempting to do nation building as part of it. Now, the early part of that period, the first 10 years, if you like, were fairly intensive, very expensive. We lost troops, we lost money in terms of the way we were doing things. And it was a very slow progression in terms of what's happening. But in the last 10 years, and particularly the last 5 years, things have taken a very different turn. The coalition presence had been reduced year on year. Afghanistan was pretty stable when it came to its politics. There had been elections. That the president who's just departed, President Ghani, had been elected twice in a national poll. He'd had a predecessor who'd also elected. So you'd had a series of democratic elections. You'd had a tapestry, if you like, of the very complicated tribal setup of Afghanistan coming together to decide to work together to try and build a country. The Taliban was still around, but they were essentially hemmed in by an increasingly smaller number of coalition troops. So we start off on this position, if you like, with a bit of stability. Yes, there were Taliban, yes, there were terrorists, but they were very much on the margins, on the sidelines, kept there by a combination of the Afghanistan National Army, its forces, and also, of course, the Western aid. Now, what then happened was Donald Trump decided that he was going to try and seek a peace deal with the Taliban. And we always knew at some point there would have to be a peace deal with the Taliban. You can't keep on fighting endlessly. And the aim of Trump, and what we can, kind of work out, is that the Taliban would come into some kind of power sharing arrangement with others and become part of the governance of Afghanistan, recognizing that it was better to, do jaw rather than war, to use the old Churchillian phrase. Now, we'll never know what the outcome of that whole Trumpian peace deal would have been, because, of course, Trump lost power last year. And as a result, he wasn't around to implement the peace deal and to see what was happening. So you're quite right to suggest that we don't know what would have happened under Trump. It may well be that the same thing would have happened, that Trump would have left in the same fashion as President Biden. However, he might not have done. The one thing we know about Donald Trump is that he likes to make deals, but he wants to stick to those deals. And if he felt the Taliban were reneging on the deal or doing something against that, it's highly likely he might have responded in a very different way to what's happened now. Okay, but that's counterfactual. We can't work out that part. We have to look at what actually has happened. And it was quite clear from very early on that President Biden wanted to leave Afghanistan. I think he had been quite keen on this policy for some time. Having been elected, he was in a position to put it into place, and he did it in a very, very short order indeed. Very quick withdrawal, very swift removal of US forces. The one thing we don't know is whether his intelligence estimates were wrong or he just ignored them, basically. Because let's not forget, just a few, just over a month ago, he was busy telling everyone, don't worry, we're going to withdraw quickly, but the Taliban aren't going to be able to walk in, the Afghan National Army will be able to keep things together and do that. What we don't really understand is whether he was getting intelligence reports to that effect, which turned out to be catastrophically wrong, and was making his decisions based on intelligence, or if he was being told something different and still, for a political reason, decided to withdraw as rapidly as he did. Now, we know that the rapid withdrawal is what has basically sucked the air out of the Afghan national forces and has led to their decline, because when you have your, if you like, your military backing removed in one fell swoop, you're suddenly there naked and alone. And even if you've got, sort of advanced kit, if you don't have the wherewithal and the ability to maintain it or to operate it without American assistance, it's as good as useless. So there's a lot of questions to be asked about how we have come to this rapid withdrawal at this time and what President Biden was thinking in doing that. And crucially, of course, as well, what this means for America's role in the world and whether allies and others can trust America's word to be a security guarantor going forwards. So as you say, lots to unpack there.
Right, right. And what do you think this means? What are the implications internally for Afghanistan? I mean, are we going to be looking at some kind of similar situation to an ISIS-controlled Syria and Iraq? Is that what we're looking at?
We've got to remember the last time the Taliban were in power, which was 1996 to 2001. Now, the Taliban themselves, although they are radical Islamists, although they adhere to an extreme form of Islam, and you remember all the beheadings and the amputations and all the destruction of women's rights, etc., that occurred last time they were in power, they weren't necessarily jihadists against the West. However, in their wake, they, of course, back in 96 to 2001, had al-Qaeda living among them, basically. Now, al-Qaeda is a separate organization to the Taliban, although there are clear familial and tribal ties in certain cases. And one can expect, therefore, to see a resurgence of al-Qaeda, again, under the Taliban once more. What you can also expect is to see the local ISIS offshoot, because ISIS has offshoots in different places as well, also set up shop in various places in Afghanistan. So what you're going to essentially see is an Islamist-ruled Afghanistan, with whatever that means for the people of Afghanistan. Of course, a humanitarian catastrophe awaits, no doubt, for them if the Taliban are true to their previous form. But we also run the risk of terrorists who want to strike at the West being emboldened and being able to operate freely and with the time and the capacity to plan attacks against the West, just as they did in that previous period, which led to 9/11.
Right, right. And what do you think will be the implications for Western politics? Because, as you say, certainly in the early 2000s and over the last 10 to 20 years, we've seen interventionism in the Middle East. And just now we heard Biden speak about the fact that the purpose of going to Afghanistan is not nation building, as perhaps might have been tried in, let's say, Iraq. And so how do you sort of distinguish between nation building versus going in to stop terrorism? And how do you know when the job is done? Is there maybe a middle path? And what does the future hold in terms of Western politics and Western interventionism in the Middle East now?
Well, I mean, Biden's being a bit disingenuous to say that it's not nation building. The reality is, if you want long-term security, you have to build up local forces to operate initially by your side and then eventually to take over from you in that way. And the only way you can do that is to build a nation. Now, if you think about Afghanistan before 2001, it was a broken country, a failed state, to use the terminology. And as such, you had to create some form of governance framework and some ability of a local power force to be able to operate and do so. And so while it is true that we didn't go into Afghanistan to nation build, by the way, we didn't go into Iraq to nation build either. There was also at least a theoretical security issue, even if it turned out not to be the case. You tend not to go to war with countries to build nations out of them. That's sort of counterintuitive. You do it for security reasons, but to coin the famous phrase of Colin Powell, if you break it, you've got to fix it. So you have to be able to do some form of, governance building, some kind of nation establishing in order to have that security issue covered. But what you're essentially trying to do in any of these operations is to firstly clear out the security threats, terrorists, whatever it might be. Then you want to then seed that area with friendly forces of various kinds. You want to assist them in whatever way you can. Sometimes that means having a very lengthy stay in a country. But of course, what you're looking to do is reduce your footprint all the time to minimal levels. And this is the irony about the Afghanistan conflict. We were really down to very minimal levels of troops in terms of coalition troops in Afghanistan and in terms of cost, and they were holding the country. So you could have kept that going if you'd have wanted to, if the Taliban were going to play ball with the peace deal, and it would have been a very limited engagement. So the oddest thing about all of this is that here's a war that America essentially has chosen to lose as opposed to being defeated on the battlefield. It's not like Vietnam where there was a war attrition, which took a lot out of America. Here, the attrition was over years ago. We were now down to, you're holding the ground, you're pacifying the country, you chose to leave and you chose to accept defeat as a result. So I think that the moral of the tale is, there are some security threats you're always going to have to confront. You're going to have to establish frameworks around them. Don't give up.
So do you think this, two questions. Number one, do you think this significantly increases the terror risk now in the West? And number two, if that was the case, what on earth was motivating Biden then to do such a swift withdrawal?
Well, let's deal with the second bit first. The second bit is simple. This is, if you like, the forever war, basically, a 20-year war. At some point, you want the troops home at this point in time. And the rationale would have been, I'm going to bring the troops home. I'm the president who's ended the never-ending war, basically. So there's a clear political dividend, in his view to do so. Now, don't forget as well, the Democratic Party these days is quite a bit to the left of where it was even, 10 years ago, let alone 20. Any sort of military engagement is not popular on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, the so-called squad people like that, basically. So this is a very easy bone to throw to that wing to say, look, I'm ending this war, I'm ending the militarism, I'm bringing the boys home, basically, and we should be fine, essentially, that way. And I suspect he either didn't know or didn't care for these sort of repercussions beyond that. What it means, though, is that the terrorist threat will, of course, increase. Because if you have a country ruled by jihadists, even if they don't want to attack the West, basically, in that sort of way, you will have groups within who will seed themselves in that country and who will do that very same eventuality. So you're getting immediately an influx of fellow travelers, if you like, more violent, more inclined to be external facing in terms of their approach. So yes, you're going to have the Al-Qaeda's, the ISIS equivalents back in Afghanistan, and that will increase the terrorist threat to the West. But there's also a more powerful message as well, a propaganda message, if you like. If you are an Islamist of any kind, you've now been able to show that you can outlast America, you can outlast the West. Okay, it took 20 years, but look who's back in charge. The Americans have had to leave tails between their legs, and radical Islam is once again in control. So it's a message really for Islamists of all stripes. It is, if you can stay the course, if you can be determined, you will ultimately win, because you will outlast the fickle West in their approach in that way. And that propaganda boost is going to have its own repercussions in terms of recruiting jihadists, recruiting Islamists, and leading them to believe that they can actually win in the struggle against liberal democracy and liberal values.
Lastly, I just want to touch on what impact this is going to have on the Middle East and also on Israel. I learned recently that the Taliban do have a relationship with Iran, and that I also learned that they have some senior Taliban officials. I don't know if their headquarters was based there at one point, but in Qatar. And I've heard some murmurs about people talking about boycotting the Qatar World Cup next year. So just wanted your thoughts on that, specifically Qatar, but also more broadly Israel, the Middle East. What are the implications?
Well, it's very interesting you bring this point up because, of course, this whole issue of alliances, if you like, and who is playing on whose side is very relevant in Afghanistan in this sort of way. And look, Iran, Afghanistan have had obviously a long, complicated relationship. The Taliban and Iran, if you think about it, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It doesn't necessarily mean that the Taliban and the mullahs are close theologically, but they both obviously have a vested interest in attacking the US, basically. So for them, it's a victory. For Iran, it's a huge victory to see the Taliban defeat the US, essentially, because it shows and gives them strength and give them hope they can do the same thing, basically. If you just outlast them, hold on, and we'll do the same as they do. The Qatar angle is also very interesting because, of course, as you know, there is a whole battle, if you like, in the Middle East for influence between the Saudi bloc and the Qatari bloc, Iran thrown in there as well. And essentially, you've got Qatar on the side of all the, I suppose, the dodgiest elements in the Middle East in that way. And anything, therefore, that gives the Qatari bloc strength in terms of, seeing one of their allies come to power, or some, in a way that diminishes the West or diminishes the Saudi bloc, is, of course, a huge shift in geopolitical tectonic plates in the Middle East. So you end up, therefore, with a Taliban win, emboldening perhaps the Qatari elements, emboldening the Iranian elements, and of course, meaning those countries who've been relying and looking to the US for leadership, the Saudi bloc, Israel to a certain extent, going, can we really rely on the US to protect us in the event of some kind of attack by our enemies in region? So if the US will not even defend Afghanistan, its allies in Afghanistan, can it be expected, if the Iranians really do something serious in terms of missile attacks or actually develop their nuclear weapon, do we really believe the Americans are going to step in and stop them attacking Israel or stop them attacking the Saudis? The question is very much out there. It's not just in the Middle East. If you're Taiwan or a country in East Asia, you're deeply concerned about the prospect of being overrun by China, and you're thinking, will the Americans actually step up? Will they defend us, or will they do what they did in Afghanistan and allow us to be overrun? So this has massive questions in the Middle East balance of power in terms of emboldening rogue regimes, emboldening regimes who are out to meddle and cause trouble, and, if you like, damaging the status quo powers in that way. But it's not just the Middle East, it's actually globally as well. And the US, therefore, has a big question to answer after this. It is, what is the American role in the world, and what is it that the US aspires to do under the Biden administration?
So my last question is, in light of what you just said, what are Israeli officials thinking right now?
Well, the Israelis will no doubt be thinking that if push comes to shove on Iran, the Americans will not be there to take the necessary action to stop an Iranian nuclear weapon. And that, therefore, gives you some very uncomfortable positions if you're sitting in Jerusalem right now. You've got to basically, you kind of know you're on your own, or you might, if you're lucky, you've got some Gulf support. But there'll come a moment fairly soon when Israel has to decide how seriously it's going to take the Iranian nuclear program. Is it going to allow these continual nonsense negotiations in Vienna to drag on as the Iranians continue to cheat in their nuclear sort of build up and get closer and closer to the bomb? Are they going to allow that, or are they going to take action into their own hands? Now, we know that is a very serious decision for Israel to make. In the past, the Israelis have intimated that an Iranian nuclear bomb is an existential issue for Israel. They will do anything required to do that. The question now is, knowing essentially that America cannot be relied upon to do the right thing in this regard, will the Israelis decide to take action themselves? And I think that decision will have to come in the next 6 months, looking at how the Iranians are making significant progress in the nuclear sphere.
Well, I don't know about you viewers, but I mean, I've been watching the news and checking all kind of articles out, but I learned more in the last 20 minutes than I have done for the last few days perusing the internet. So, Alan Mendoza, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to us and to inform our viewers about what's going on. I really, really appreciate your time, and I hope we can do this again sometime.
Would love to. Thank you all. Yes, keep tuned on the international scene, because I'm afraid we're in for more thrills and spills.
Thank you so much.